I was surrounded by luxury. Marble floors reflected my footsteps, crystal chandeliers shone above my head, and every detail of my life was polished to perfection. My wardrobe was filled with designer labels. My car was sleek and black with tinted windows, and every person who worked for me treated me as though I were untouchable. I carried that untouchable arrogance wherever I went, flaunting it like jewelry that sparkled brighter than anyone else's existence. People whispered about me when I walked into a room, but I never cared whether they whispered out of admiration or out of fear, because in my world, admiration and fear felt the same. It was not enough for me to be wealthy. I needed to be seen. I craved attention, the kind that makes heads turn and mouths fall open. When I laughed loudly at expensive restaurants, it wasn't because the joke was truly funny, but because I loved the way people looked over with envy. When I dismissed waiters with a flick of my hand, it wasn't because I disliked them personally, but because power fed me like oxygen. I had convinced myself that I was above others, that life had divided us into classes for a reason, and that I had been blessed to stand on the highest level of that invisible ladder. Pride was not just a trait for me, it was a way of breathing. That was the mindset I carried the afternoon I saw her. The streets were busy that day, cars honking, vendors shouting, and people rushing through their lives. I was walking out of a boutique, bags in both hands, designer sunglasses shielding my eyes. I remember feeling particularly radiant, the kind of confidence that rises after a shopping spree where you believe you've purchased not just clothes, but an extra layer of superiority. And then, almost like a stain on the perfect picture of my day, I saw her. She was sitting near the corner of the street, her clothes torn and faded from time, her hands wrinkled and cracked like fragile paper. Her hair was gray, tangled, and falling over her face, and her posture was hunched as though life had bent her spine with the weight of endless suffering. She had a small basket of trinkets and cheap items placed in front of her, plastic combs, faded scarves, and some old-fashioned jewelry that nobody would buy. She was trying to sell them to passers-by, but people walked past her as though she were invisible, as though she were part of the pavement rather than a human being. I could have walked past her too. I should have walked past her too. But something inside me refused to let the moment slip quietly. Instead, I stopped, looked down at her with the cruelest smirk curling on my lips, and said loudly enough for others nearby to hear, "Do you really think anyone wants that garbage? You should be ashamed of sitting here like this. Maybe if you had worked harder when you were younger, you wouldn't be such a pitiful sight today." Her head lifted slowly, her eyes meeting mine, and I felt a rush of satisfaction because people around us had stopped to watch. I loved an audience. I thrived on the sound of whispers, on the way strangers' eyes widened when I spoke my venom without hesitation. I bent slightly toward her, my voice dripping with mockery, and added, "Do yourself a favor and disappear from places where real people live their lives. You don't belong here. You belong in the shadows where no one has to see your pathetic existence." The laughter that followed wasn't hers. It was mine, echoing down the busy street as I tossed my hair back. People around me exchanged awkward looks, some with disgust, some with silent pity for her. But none of them dared to stop me. Why would they? I looked untouchable, a woman in expensive clothes and towering heels, standing over a helpless figure on the ground. To me, it was just another performance, another reminder to the world that I had the power to decide who mattered and who did not. But what unsettled me was not her appearance, not her basket of cheap goods, and not even her silence as I poured cruelty on her. It was her reaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't even look angry. Instead, her lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile so fragile it almost seemed out of place. Her eyes, though clouded with age, had a strange familiarity in them, as though they had looked at me before, long before this very day. That smile was not of a woman defeated, nor of one too weak to fight back. It was something else, something that pierced the armor of arrogance I had wrapped around myself for years. For the first time in a long while, my words felt as though they had bounced off someone instead of striking them. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Why would she smile at me like that after I had humiliated her so publicly? Why didn't she scream, curse, or lower her head in shame? Her calmness was louder than my cruelty, her silence heavier than all the words I had thrown at her. I remember walking away with my shopping bags, my head still high, but something in my chest felt oddly heavy. That smile followed me long after I turned the corner, as though it had imprinted itself in my memory against my will. At night, I found myself replaying the moment over and over. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself she was just another beggar, just another worthless soul drifting through life. But my mind refused to let go of her eyes. There was something in them that felt too familiar, too unsettling, like a reflection of something I did not want to confront. The pride in me tried to bury it, but the memory lingered like a ghost, waiting in the shadows, whispering that this encounter was not just a meaningless coincidence. And I couldn't shake the feeling, no matter how hard I tried, that she hadn't been looking at me as a stranger. She had been looking at me as though she knew me. Why did her reaction feel like she knew me? Everyone feared me, but deep down I didn't know fear was waiting for me in the most unexpected form. If I had to describe my life back then, the word would have been untouchable. From the outside, I was everything a woman could dream of being: wealthy, beautiful, and commanding the kind of respect that wasn't earned but demanded. My home was not just a place to live. It was a fortress of excess, filled with imported furniture, velvet curtains, chandeliers that sparkled like fallen stars, and art pieces that cost more than what most people made in years. My mornings began with breakfast served on silver trays, exotic fruits cut into perfect slices, and staff moving like shadows to anticipate my needs before I even voiced them. Luxury wasn't a privilege for me. It was a birthright. I didn't just live in wealth, I breathed it, wore it, and walked in it as though it were the very skin on my body. When I entered a room, silence often followed. Some would call it respect, but I knew better. It was fear. People measured their words around me. They bent their backs lower than necessary. They agreed even when they disagreed. I thrived on it. The power of knowing that others dared not correct me, that their voices faltered when mine rose. It was intoxicating. Pride is a drug, and I was overdosing on it daily without even realizing the poison it planted in me. It wasn't only my wealth that separated me from others. It was my arrogance. If I saw someone beneath me, and in my eyes, almost everyone was beneath me, I treated them like props in the theater of my life. Waiters existed to serve, not to be respected. Drivers existed to obey, not to be thanked. Assistants existed to be scolded, not encouraged. And I made sure they knew their place with every roll of my eyes, every sigh of impatience, every word that dripped with condescension. I remember one evening at a high-end restaurant. My friends and I were dining, glasses of champagne in hand, when the waiter mistakenly brought me the wrong order. It was a small error, one that could have been corrected with a simple request, but I chose cruelty instead. I raised my voice, not because I was angry, but because I knew people were watching. "Is this what passes for service here?" I said loudly enough for every table nearby to hear. The poor man apologized again and again, his hands trembling as he offered to replace the dish. But I continued, tearing into him with words sharper than knives. My friends laughed, some uncomfortably, but none of them dared to stop me. I didn't want the correct meal. I wanted dominance. And when the waiter finally left, his head lowered in shame, I felt triumphant, as though I had won a battle no one else even knew existed. Another memory. Shopping at a luxury boutique. A young salesgirl suggested a dress she thought might suit me. It wasn't to my liking, but instead of politely declining, I sneered at her, saying, "Do you think I wear what you wear? Don't project your cheap taste onto me." Her face flushed red, and I could see tears threatening to spill, but I turned away, satisfied with the power of my words. To me, cruelty wasn't cruelty. It was entertainment. I wore my arrogance like a crown, and every insult I hurled was another jewel added to it. Yet, despite all my confidence, there were moments I could never explain. They were fleeting, almost unnoticeable, but they existed. Every now and then, when I walked through crowded streets, faces would blur into one another, and I would feel an unshakable jolt of recognition. I would pass a stranger, and my heart would skip a beat, as if a memory was tugging at me, whispering from the shadows. Sometimes it was an old man's eyes that lingered too long. Sometimes a child's laughter that felt hauntingly familiar. And sometimes it was just the curve of someone's smile that made me feel as though I had seen it before in another lifetime. I hated those moments. They unsettled me, threatened the narrative of control I had built around myself. When such feelings rose, I buried them beneath layers of denial. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the imagination playing cruel tricks, that I was too important to waste time on such nonsense. Yet the unease they left behind lingered, like a whisper you can't silence. And then came the day I mocked that old woman on the street. It should have been no different than all the other times I had belittled strangers for amusement. But it wasn't. Something in her eyes, those weary, weathered eyes that looked straight into mine without flinching, pulled at me with an almost magnetic force. I had mocked her publicly, crushed her dignity with laughter, yet instead of breaking, she had smiled at me with a calmness that didn't make sense. It was a smile that didn't belong to a beggar. It was a smile that felt too personal, too knowing, too intimate, as if she had been looking at me not as a stranger, but as someone connected to her in a way I could not understand. That smile haunted me in the days that followed, seeping into the cracks of my pride, replaying itself whenever I closed my eyes. And deep down, though I tried to drown it in denial, one question grew louder inside me with every passing day. Why did I feel a strange connection to that old woman? When the world mocked her silence, they didn't realize she was carrying secrets louder than screams. I had thought the encounter with the old woman would disappear from my memory as quickly as it came, just like all the other faces I mocked and forgot. Yet she lingered. Her smile followed me like a shadow, haunting me in moments when I least expected it. It wasn't just her eyes that unsettled me. It was the way she seemed immune to my cruelty. The more I tried to dismiss it, the more it echoed in my mind. Soon, my curiosity betrayed me. Against my own arrogance, I began to wonder who she really was. In my world, curiosity was dangerous because it forced me to pay attention to people I had always considered beneath me. But something about her wouldn't let go. It started with whispers I overheard when I walked past that same street a few days later. Vendors who shared the space with her spoke about her in hushed tones, not loud enough for her to hear, but loud enough for me to catch fragments of her story. "She's been here for years," one man muttered as he arranged cheap trinkets on his stall. "Never asks for charity, just sits with those little things trying to sell. Most people ignore her." Another woman chimed in, shaking her head with pity. "They say she wasn't always like this. Once, she lived a life better than any of us. Married into money, or maybe born into it. No one really knows for sure. But something happened. Something terrible. Now look at her." I stood a few steps away, pretending to examine a scarf at another stall, but my ears strained to catch every word. My heart beat faster, though I didn't understand why. She was just a poor old woman. Yet my chest tightened with every whisper that floated through the air. Over the next few days, I heard more. Some said her husband had abandoned her, leaving her to raise a child alone. Others claimed her child had been taken from her at birth, stolen away by relatives who didn't want the shame of poverty attached to their name. There were those who swore she once lived in a grand home on the hill, surrounded by wealth, but that betrayal and greed from people close to her had stripped it all away. No one could tell the full truth. They only had fragments, rumors pieced together like a shattered mirror reflecting 1,000 broken versions of her life. Yet through all of it, one thing remained consistent. She never spoke about her past. Not once. No matter how many people gossiped, no matter how many cruel comments were thrown at her by passers-by, she remained silent. She didn't defend herself, didn't correct the lies, didn't confirm the truths. She carried her history like a locked chest, the key hidden somewhere no one could reach. And that silence infuriated me. It wasn't the silence of weakness. It was the silence of someone who knew more than anyone dared to imagine. I found myself watching her from a distance more often than I cared to admit. I would sit in my car sometimes, parked far enough that she wouldn't notice me, and observe her daily routine. Morning after morning, she would arrive at her corner, carefully placing her basket of small items in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she arranged each scarf and trinket with care, as though they were priceless treasures instead of scraps most people overlooked. She never begged. She never reached out to stop someone, never pleaded for money. She simply sat there, waiting, her eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet patience that unsettled me. And I noticed something else. Sometimes, when children passed by, she smiled at them in the same way she had smiled at me. It wasn't a simple smile of politeness. It was deeper, almost maternal, as though she carried love for strangers she had never met. Parents would tug their children along quickly, wary of letting them linger near her. But the look in her eyes never changed. It was the look of a woman who had known loss, who had once cradled something precious and had it taken away. There was one afternoon when I saw her counting the money she had earned that day. A few coins and one crumpled note. That was all. Yet instead of despair, she tucked it away with the same calmness she carried everywhere. I wanted to hate her calmness. I wanted to despise the way she seemed unbroken despite everything. But instead, I felt something else. An unease, a gnawing at the edges of my pride that whispered she was not who I thought she was. I began to imagine her past in ways that startled me. What if she had once walked through the same boutiques I shopped in? What if she had once worn silks and diamonds, only to lose them all? What if her silence was not weakness, but strength, because she knew that the truth of her story was too powerful to waste on the careless ears of strangers? And then came a rumor that struck me harder than all the rest. I overheard it from a pair of old women sitting outside a bakery, their voices low but steady. They say she had a daughter once, one whispered. A beautiful girl. But they were separated. No one knows where the daughter went, or if she even survived. Some think the girl was taken in by another family. Some say the child grew up rich while the mother was left with nothing. The words hit me like a thunderclap. A daughter. The image of her eyes staring into mine, filled with that strange familiarity, returned with sharper clarity. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Why did that rumor make me feel as though the ground beneath me had shifted? Why did my heart pound, as if it recognized something my mind refused to accept? I told myself it was nonsense, just another tale spun by bored tongues with nothing better to do. But no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, the thought took root in my mind. Every time I saw her now, I couldn't help but imagine that lost daughter she once had. And somewhere deep inside me, though I tried to silence it, a question whispered with cruel persistence. Could her past somehow connect to my present? One moment of cruelty can come back to destroy your entire life. When I walked away from that street after mocking her, I felt untouchable. The sound of my laughter echoed in my ears, a triumphant melody that fed my arrogance. I believed it was just another performance, another moment where I had displayed my power in front of strangers and reminded them that I stood above them all. For me, it was entertainment, an act of superiority that would fade from memory by the time I reached home. But what I didn't realize that day was how one cruel moment could spread like wildfire, carried by whispers, turning into a storm that I would not be able to control. The very next morning, as I entered a cafe I often visited, I noticed the shift in atmosphere. Usually people's eyes followed me with admiration or envy, but this time their gazes lingered with something else, something sharper, heavier, almost accusatory. I ignored it, brushing it off as paranoia. But then, as I sipped my coffee, I overheard a group at the next table. They didn't see me sitting there at first. "Did you hear about that spoiled woman yesterday?" one of them whispered. "She humiliated that old seller in front of everyone, treated her like dirt." Another responded, "Yes, I saw it. My cousin was there. She said the poor woman didn't even defend herself, just sat there smiling." I froze, my cup halfway to my lips. They weren't speaking about just any woman. They were speaking about me. My blood boiled, not from shame, but from the fact that they dared to talk about me so casually. When one of them finally noticed me and went pale, stuttering an excuse before rushing out, I simply rolled my eyes. In my world, gossip was harmless. I told myself that in a few days, it would disappear. People always needed new stories to chew on, and I believed I was too powerful for something so trivial to matter. But I was wrong. Within days, I noticed the change everywhere I went. At boutiques, salesgirls no longer rushed to serve me with smiles. Instead, they did so stiffly, their eyes avoiding mine. At restaurants, whispers followed me more than admiration. Even at parties, I caught people exchanging glances when I entered the room, their conversations halting before quickly shifting to polite small talk. I heard the word cruel more than once, drifting through the air like a curse. At first, I pretended not to care. I told myself their opinions meant nothing. I was still rich, still beautiful, still powerful. What could their whispers possibly do to me? But denial is a fragile shield, and soon enough, the cracks began to show. There were moments when I caught my reflection in the mirror, and, for the briefest second, I saw her face overlapping mine, the old woman's weary eyes staring back at me from my own features. It unsettled me so deeply that I smashed a glass once, the shards scattering across my marble floor as though I could shatter the haunting memory with it. The problem wasn't the gossip itself. It was her silence. If she had shouted back at me, cursed me, or created a scene, the memory would have dissolved. If she had begged or cried, I could have dismissed her as weak and pitiful. But she didn't. She gave me nothing. Only that faint smile, that unshaken stare, as though she knew something I did not. That silence began to grow louder in my head with each passing day. I started to avoid that street corner, telling myself I was too busy, too important to go near such places. But the truth was, I was afraid of seeing her again. Afraid of those eyes that saw through me. Afraid of that calmness that had survived my cruelty. I tried to bury the memory under layers of arrogance, but it crept into my dreams. Sometimes I would dream of her sitting on the street, but when she lifted her head, it wasn't her wrinkled face I saw. It was a reflection of myself, aged and broken, staring back at me with that same smile. I would wake in a cold sweat, gasping, furious at myself for letting her invade my mind. And the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew. People began embellishing the story. Some claimed I had thrown money in her face. Others said I had pushed her basket over, spilling her belongings. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. Gossip doesn't need truth. It needs fuel, and I had provided enough with my arrogance. My reputation, once untouchable, was now tainted by the image of me standing over a poor old woman, mocking her while she sat in silence. There was one particular afternoon that sealed it for me. I was at a charity gala, an event where people flaunted generosity for the sake of being seen as kind. I was dressed in a gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, jewels glittering at my neck, every detail of my appearance curated to perfection. I walked in expecting admiration, but instead I was met with uneasy glances. Whispers slithered through the air, and though no one said it to my face, I knew. They were all thinking of her. During the auction, when a painting was being bid on, the host casually mentioned the importance of compassion for the poor. His eyes flicked in my direction for a fraction of a second, and I felt the weight of the room pressing down on me. I smiled, pretending not to notice, but inside I was boiling. The humiliation of being silently judged, of being measured not by my wealth but by that one act, was unbearable. But even in that moment, what burned me most wasn't the gossip or the judgment. It was her. That silent smile, those knowing eyes, the calmness that refused to die. It had carved itself into me like a scar I couldn't erase. No matter how many diamonds I wore, no matter how loudly I laughed, no matter how arrogantly I walked into a room, I couldn't drown out the memory. It was as though she had planted something inside me the moment she looked at me. A seed of unease that grew stronger with each whisper I heard. I began to wonder, against my own will, if perhaps she knew something about me, something about my past or my future that I didn't. The thought was absurd, but it clawed at me nonetheless. And as the whispers around me refused to die, as her silent stare replayed in my mind like a curse, I began to feel a question rise, one I couldn't silence anymore. Would this old woman return to confront me? I thought I had everything under control, until the day the law came crashing into my life. For years, I believed I was untouchable. Problems were things that happened to other people, not me. I lived in a world where my wealth was my shield, my arrogance my weapon, and my connections my safety net. If something went wrong, I simply threw money at it until it disappeared. That was the rhythm of my life, smooth, unshakable, without consequence. Or so I thought. The first crack appeared one morning when I received a letter delivered to my doorstep, thicker and heavier than most envelopes. At first I didn't even open it myself. My assistant placed it on the counter, and I barely glanced at it while sipping my imported coffee. But when she nervously mentioned that it looked important, I tore it open with impatience. My eyes scanned the legal letterhead, and for the first time in years I felt a pang of unease. It was a notice to appear in court. At first I laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that echoed through my kitchen. Court? For me? The very idea felt ridiculous. Surely there had been some mistake, perhaps some trivial matter that my lawyers could handle within minutes. I set the letter aside, brushing it off as though it were nothing more than junk mail. But the truth was, the seed of dread had been planted, and within days that seed began to grow. The details came pouring in, and with them, my arrogance twisted into something uglier. It wasn't a mistake. I was being summoned over an inheritance dispute. Family assets tangled in greed and betrayal, accusations of fraud swirling around my name. Relatives who had smiled at me at dinners were now sharpening knives behind my back, eager to take from me what they claimed was rightfully theirs. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't some small matter. This was a war, and I was at the center of it. But instead of fear, I chose pride. I convinced myself that I would win, not because I was innocent, but because I was powerful. Money could buy silence, money could buy influence, money could bend justice in ways truth never could. I told myself that the courtroom was nothing more than another stage, another place for me to show that I was above everyone else. The weeks leading up to the hearing were filled with tension I refused to acknowledge. My lawyers called repeatedly, their voices carrying concern, but I dismissed them with arrogance. "Just do your job," I snapped once when one of them suggested settling quietly. "I don't settle. I win." My confidence wasn't rooted in facts or evidence. It was rooted in the belief that I had never truly faced consequences before. And I wouldn't start now. The morning of the court date, I woke earlier than usual. I stood in front of my mirror, draped in a sleek black dress, pearls at my neck, hair styled to perfection. My reflection looked every bit the part of a woman in control, a woman untouchable by scandal or shame. I remember smirking at myself, whispering, "Let them try." The drive to the courthouse felt like a parade. My car gleamed in the sunlight, cutting through traffic with ease as though the world itself made way for me. People on the sidewalks turned their heads, and I soaked in their stares. I stepped out of the car with sunglasses shielding my eyes, heels clicking against the pavement, every movement deliberate, practiced, powerful. For me, this wasn't a trial. It was a performance. As I entered the courthouse, the air inside felt heavier, colder. People moved around with urgency, papers shuffled, voices echoed down the hallways. Yet I walked as though I owned the place, chin high, lips curved into a faint smile. To me, the courtroom wasn't a place of justice. It was a place where I would remind everyone who I was. When I finally took my seat, my lawyers flanked me on either side, their faces tight with unease. I ignored them. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the wooden benches, the stern faces of clerks and bailiffs, the quiet hum of anticipation. Opposite me sat my relatives, their expressions a mixture of bitterness and greed. I almost laughed at the sight of them, thinking how pathetic they looked, clinging to their fragile hopes that they could defeat me. The judge entered, and the room stood in respect. I rose with the others, though in my heart I stood not out of respect, but because it was required. The proceedings began, voices droning, documents shuffled. I sat back in my chair, crossing my legs, exuding an air of absolute confidence. My mind was not on the evidence or the arguments. It was on the inevitable victory I believed awaited me. But then, as the case unfolded, something shifted. There was a pause, a murmur that spread through the courtroom as the judge mentioned the arrival of a key witness. My heart didn't skip a beat. I wasn't worried. After all, no witness could shake me. Or so I thought. The doors opened, and in that single moment my confidence cracked. I turned my head, expecting to see a lawyer, perhaps another relative, or some minor player dragged into the drama. Instead, I saw her. The old woman. The one I had mocked. The one whose eyes had haunted me in silence, whose smile had unsettled me for weeks. She walked slowly, her steps unsteady, yet firm, her presence pulling the air out of the room. The whispers rose immediately. People recognized her, though not in the way they recognized me. She wasn't a figure of power. She was a figure of mystery, of quiet strength, of hidden truth. My throat tightened, my palms dampened, though I fought to keep my composure. Of all people, of all faces, why hers? Why here? Why now? In that instant, the courtroom no longer felt like a stage I controlled. It felt like a trap, and I was no longer the predator. I was the prey. But who would walk into that same courtroom to destroy my confidence? When the doors opened, my world stopped, because the last person I expected walked in. The sound of the courtroom doors creaking open echoed louder than any gavel I had ever heard. For a brief second, the world seemed to pause, as if time itself held its breath. I turned my head casually, expecting nothing more than another lawyer or perhaps a clerk with stacks of papers. But when my eyes landed on her, my body froze. It was her, the old woman, the one I had ridiculed on the street, the one whose silence had mocked me louder than words ever could. She looked the same as I remembered, her frail body draped in worn clothes, her gray hair falling in loose strands, her hands clutching a small purse as though it were her only possession in the world. Yet something about her presence felt entirely different in that room. On the street, she had been invisible to most. Here, in this courtroom, Every eye turned toward her as if she were the most important person in the world. Gasps rippled through the benches. Whispers began to flow like a current, sharp and unstoppable. People leaned into each other, murmuring questions, trading theories. I caught fragments of their voices. Who is she? Why would they call her? What does she have to do with this case? Their eyes shifted from her to me, and the weight of their stares pressed heavily on my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, though I tried to keep my face composed. Inside, however, my mind was spiraling. Memories of that day came flooding back, the way I had stood above her with arrogance dripping from my words, the way I had laughed as people looked on, the way her faint, unsettling smile had pierced through my cruelty. I had thought it ended there, just another performance in the theater of my pride. But now, as she walked down the aisle of the courtroom, I realized it had been the beginning of something much larger. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, her frailty visible but her aura unshaken. It was as if she carried not just herself, but the weight of truths buried for years. My chest tightened as the realization grew inside me. She wasn't here by coincidence. She was here for a reason, and that reason had something to do with me. I felt the eyes of my relatives burning into me from across the room. Their expressions were a mixture of confusion and satisfaction, as though they knew something I didn't. My lawyers leaned toward me, whispering questions I barely heard. My hands gripped the edge of the bench so tightly that my knuckles turned white. For the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't control. Fear. Questions tore through my mind with merciless speed. Why was she here? What could she possibly know about this case? Was she here to testify against me? To humiliate me in the very room where I believed I would shine? Could this frail old woman, whom I had dismissed as worthless, hold power over me? The very thought was unbearable, yet undeniable. The judge acknowledged her arrival, and for a moment the silence in the room was deafening. She was sworn in, her trembling hand raised, her voice steady despite her fragile body. I watched in disbelief. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like someone being dragged into a battle she didn't understand. She looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment, patiently, silently, with the certainty of a person who carried truth in her very bones. I tried to convince myself she was irrelevant, a pawn brought in by my opponents to waste time. I whispered to myself that she couldn't possibly matter, that she was just a distraction. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. There was something about the way she stood, the way her eyes scanned the room and paused, on me, that screamed this was no accident. And then, that look. The look she gave me across the courtroom was the same one she had given me on the street. Calm, unbroken, knowing. It wasn't the look of a stranger. It was the look of someone who saw deeper, someone who held a piece of me I didn't even know was missing. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Her gaze pinned me in place, stripping me bare in front of everyone, exposing cracks in the armor I had spent years polishing. The whispers in the room grew louder. Some people tilted their heads, glancing between us as if they sensed something unspoken. I felt my face flush, a mixture of rage and shame boiling inside me. I wanted to stand, to shout, to demand why she was here, but the weight of the room pressed me down into my seat. My lawyers scribbled notes frantically, one of them leaning in to mutter, "We didn't know about her. She wasn't on the list." His voice trembled with unease, and that alone made my pulse race faster. If even they were caught off guard, it meant she wasn't just another witness. She was something more, something dangerous. As she settled into the witness chair, the silence returned. The judge looked at her expectantly. The lawyers prepared their questions, and the room waited for her words. My throat was dry, my palms damp, And though I fought to maintain the image of control, I knew the truth. I was no longer in control. The old woman, the one I had mocked without mercy, the one I had dismissed as beneath me, now sat in the very seat that could determine my future. Her silence had once haunted me, but now her voice could destroy me. And as her lips parted, I braced myself because I knew whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. Was she just a witness, or was she the key to my fate? The truth started peeling away layers of lies I never knew existed. As the old woman sat in the witness chair, the room seemed to hold its breath. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my skin, making every second stretch into eternity. I tried to steady my hands, to keep my posture tall and unbroken, but inside I was unraveling. My heart beat against my ribs like a drum, and my mind swirled with questions I couldn't answer. Why was she here? How could she possibly matter to my case? What truth did she carry that could warrant her presence in this courtroom? The lawyer representing my relatives stood, papers in hand, his voice sharp with confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "what we are about to present may seem unusual, but it is central to the matter of this inheritance dispute. This witness is not a stranger to the family, nor is she irrelevant. She is, in fact, tied to the very foundation of the family's wealth." I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. Tied to the family's wealth? My mind recoiled instantly, searching for ways to dismiss it. Perhaps she had once worked as a servant in one of our estates, or maybe she was connected to some forgotten relative by marriage. Whatever it was, I told myself, it couldn't possibly matter. It couldn't touch me. But when the old woman lifted her head and looked directly at me, I knew my denial wouldn't last. "She is not just a beggar you see sitting on the streets," the lawyer continued, pacing with deliberate steps. "She has lived a life intertwined with this family's fortune and its darkest betrayals." He paused, holding up a folder thick with documents. "And the evidence is right here." My chest tightened as he opened the folder and withdrew several yellowed papers, their edges worn with time. He handed them to the judge, who examined them with a heavy expression before passing them to my lawyer. My lawyer's hands trembled as he scanned the pages, his face growing paler with each line he read. "What is it?" I hissed under my breath, but he didn't answer. He simply looked at me, his eyes filled with something I had never seen before when directed at me. Pity. The opposing lawyer's voice sliced through the silence. "These documents are records of transactions, ownerships, and wills that were manipulated years ago. At the heart of them lies not just greed, but betrayal of blood itself. And this woman," he gestured toward her with a sweeping hand, "is living proof of the family's darkest secret." My stomach lurched. Betrayal of blood? My mind rejected it immediately. It couldn't be possible. The old woman shifted in her chair, her face calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't look like someone who had come to fight. She looked like someone who had simply come to tell the truth. And that terrified me. The lawyer went on, his words striking like hammer blows. "Years ago, a portion of the family fortune was not inherited fairly. Property, titles, and wealth were stolen, not from outsiders, but from family itself. This woman was directly affected. Her life was shattered, reduced to poverty because of decisions made to erase her and her claim. I felt the blood drain from my face. My throat was dry, but I forced myself to scoff, leaning back in my chair. "This is ridiculous," I muttered loudly enough for those around me to hear. "She's just a poor woman grasping at straws. None of this will stand in court." My words were sharp, dripping with contempt. But they didn't sound as strong as I wanted them to. Even I could hear the cracks in my voice. The lawyer ignored me, turning instead to the judge. "Your Honor, we will prove through these documents that this woman was not just wronged, but erased from history. And the consequences of that erasure extend to the very inheritance we are fighting over today." My mind spun. Erased from history? How could a woman who sold trinkets on the street have anything to do with my life, my wealth, my family? It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Then the old woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying across the room with surprising strength. I never wanted this. I never asked for riches or revenge. All I wanted was to be remembered, to be acknowledged. But I was cast aside, left with nothing. And now, the truth has found its way back, whether they want it or not. Her words pierced through me, cutting deeper than I expected. My chest tightened as her eyes found mine again. I looked away quickly, but it was too late. The connection had been made. The opposing lawyer presented more documents. Birth certificates, property transfers, signatures that looked eerily familiar. Each page felt like a blow, each piece of evidence another thread unraveling the story I thought I knew about my family. I wanted to believe it was all forged, fabricated lies meant to humiliate me. But the papers were old, weathered, stamped with seals that carried authenticity no one could deny. My lawyer tried to object, to question the relevance, but his arguments sounded weak even to my ears. The judge overruled him repeatedly, allowing the evidence to stand. My confidence, once towering like an unshakable wall, began to crack. For the first time, I felt the courtroom tilting against me. The whispers in the audience grew louder, and I knew what they were thinking. The proud woman who had mocked a beggar was now being undone by her. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, fighting the urge to scream. Inside me, denial battled with dread. Who was she, really? What did she want? How could she possibly be tied to my family, to me? None of it made sense, yet the documents told a story I couldn't ignore. A story where she wasn't just some stranger living in the shadows, but someone whose blood might be closer to mine than I dared to imagine. And then the lawyer said the words that shattered the thin veil of control I had left. This woman is not here by accident. She is not a stranger to this family. She is part of it. The words echoed in my head, louder than the pounding of my heart. My mouth went dry, my body stiff, as every arrogant defense I had built around myself crumbled piece by piece. What was the one truth that could shatter everything I believed about myself? The woman I mocked in front of the world was not a stranger. She was blood. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing every whisper, every murmur in the courtroom. My body stiffened, my breath caught in my throat, and my entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. I wanted to believe I had misheard, that this was some elaborate trick, a cruel tactic meant to break my confidence. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. I sat there, frozen, as the lawyer's voice pressed on, sharp and relentless. This woman, whom the family cast aside, is not just some forgotten relative or distant connection. She is the mother of the very woman sitting before you. His hand extended in my direction, his words cutting through the room like a blade. Yes, Your Honor. She is her mother. Gasps erupted from the benches. The sound swelled around me, but it was distant, muffled, as though I were underwater. I could feel every eye on me, burning into my skin, judging me, pitying me. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would break through my chest. I shook my head slowly, whispering to myself, "No, no, this isn't possible." I turned toward her, desperate for denial in her expression, for some sign that this was all a lie. But she didn't deny it. She didn't flinch. Her calm gaze held mine with a quiet strength, her lips trembling slightly, but her eyes steady. It was the same look she had given me on the street, the look that had unsettled me so deeply. Now I understood why. She hadn't been looking at me as a stranger. She had been looking at me as her daughter. I wanted to scream, to reject it, to stand and shout that this was some fabricated story, that she was lying for sympathy, that she was trying to drag me down with her misery. But the documents, the evidence, The undeniable truth laid out on the judge's desk said otherwise. The lawyer began to unravel her story, a story I had never known, a story that had been buried beneath wealth and silence. Years ago, she had been part of the family's inner circle, married young, filled with hope and dreams. She had given birth to a daughter, me, but betrayal had crept in like poison. Greedy relatives, seeking to control the fortune, had deemed her unworthy. Lies were spun, documents forged, and she was forced out, stripped of everything she owned. Her child, her only child, was taken from her arms. That child had been handed to others, raised under a different story, a different truth. That child grew up believing she was born into privilege, never knowing the woman who had carried her, who had wept as she was torn away. That child was me. The courtroom blurred around me as her backstory unraveled. I saw her life in flashes painted by the lawyer's words, her standing helpless as they tore me away, her begging for mercy, her being silenced with threats. I saw her walking the streets, stripped of dignity, reduced to selling scraps just to survive. And all the while, she carried the memory of me, the daughter she lost, the blood that was stolen from her. The audience listened in stunned silence, but my mind roared with chaos. I tried to hold on to denial, but it slipped from my grasp like sand through trembling fingers. Her face, her eyes, that faint smile, it all fit too perfectly. I had mocked her, humiliated her, spat cruelty at her in front of strangers, never realizing I was striking the very woman who had given me life. Shame burned through me, hotter than fire. My arrogance, my pride, my superiority, all of it collapsed under the crushing weight of this revelation. I remembered every word I had said to her on that street. You should be ashamed of yourself. You don't belong here. You're pathetic. I had thrown those words like daggers, not knowing I was stabbing my own mother. I pressed my hands against my face, desperate to hide from the stares, from the unbearable reality. My lawyers tried to maintain composure, but even they looked shaken. I could feel the whispers behind me, the silent judgment of the courtroom. The proud, wealthy woman was now exposed as nothing more than a cruel child who had mocked her own mother. And yet, amidst the shame, disbelief coiled tightly around me. How could this be true? Why hadn't I known? Why hadn't anyone told me? I had lived my entire life in luxury, never questioning its origins, never wondering what was hidden beneath its golden surface. I had trusted the story given to me, that I was born into privilege, that I deserved it. But now the foundation of that story crumbled, revealing betrayal, lies, and abandonment at its core. I forced myself to look at her again, to truly see her. The wrinkles on her face weren't just signs of age. They were etched by years of pain, of longing, of survival. Her hands, cracked and weathered, had once held me. Her eyes, those haunting eyes, carried love that had been denied expression for decades. She didn't look at me with anger, though she had every reason to. She looked at me with sorrow, with quiet strength, with something I couldn't name but felt deep in my bones. The contrast between us was unbearable. I sat there in my expensive dress, pearls gleaming at my throat, my hands manicured and polished, while she sat in her plain clothes, her body frail and worn. Yet in that moment, she looked stronger than me. She carried dignity that I had never known. She carried truth, while I sat drowning in lies. My mind spiraled in disbelief. I wanted to hate her for the truth she revealed, to push the blame onto her, to convince myself she had abandoned me willingly. But the documents, the testimonies, the timeline all pointed to one undeniable reality. She hadn't left me. She had been forced to let me go. And I had grown up despising her without even knowing her. Tears stung my eyes, but pride held them back. I couldn't break here, not in front of everyone, not in front of her. But inside, I was already broken. The pieces of my identity scattered across the floor, and I didn't know how to gather them. Who was I now if everything I believed about my life was a lie? Who was I? If my blood was hers? I had mocked her. I had spit venom at her. I had laughed at her poverty, blind to the fact that her suffering was the very reason I had lived in wealth. The shame consumed me, clawing at every part of my soul. And yet a deeper question rose like a knife in the dark. If she was my mother, if her blood ran through my veins, what did that make me? Was I still the woman I thought I was? Or had I been living a stolen life? The courtroom blurred further, the faces blending together, the voices fading. All I could see was her. All I could hear was the question pounding inside me, relentless and cruel. How could I ever face her now that I knew the truth? In one moment, everything I had built crumbled into dust. The revelation struck me harder than any physical blow could have. I sat there in that courtroom, my back straight, my head high, but inside I was nothing more than shattered glass scattered across a marble floor. The walls I had built around myself, pride, arrogance, wealth, and power, collapsed in an instant, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, and unbearably human. The silence after the lawyer's words was deafening, yet it wasn't silence at all. It was filled with whispers, gasps, and the weight of countless eyes pressing down on me. Every person in that courtroom now saw me not as the woman who walked in with untouchable arrogance, but as the daughter who had mocked her own mother without knowing. I had always believed public humiliation was reserved for others. I had been the one delivering it, standing tall while others shrank beneath my cruelty. But now the roles had reversed. I was the one shrinking, the one trembling, the one fighting desperately to hold myself together while the world watched my pride burn to ashes. The whispers stung like venom. I couldn't make out every word, but the fragments were enough. That's her mother? After everything she said to her on the street? What kind of daughter does that? Their words cut through me, sharper than any knife, and I realized with a sickening twist in my stomach that they were right. What kind of daughter mocks her own mother? What kind of human being looks at the woman who gave her life and spits venom without a second thought? I pressed my nails into my palms until I felt the sting of pain, but even that couldn't drown out the truth. My arrogance had shattered completely. The judge's gavel came down to silence the whispers, but it didn't silence the noise in my head. My thoughts screamed at me, memories replaying over and over, the street corner, my laughter, her faint smile. I wanted to claw those memories out of my mind, erase them forever, but they were etched too deeply now. And the cruelest part was knowing that everyone else remembered too. They had witnessed my arrogance in public, and now they were witnessing my downfall in the same way. The humiliation I had inflicted had come full circle, pressing down on me with unbearable weight. I tried to steady myself, to sit straighter, to cling to the last fragments of my pride, but my body betrayed me. My hands shook visibly, my lips trembled, and I could feel the sting of tears threatening to spill. I blinked rapidly, desperate to keep them back, but each blink only made them burn hotter. My entire life, I had sworn never to cry in front of anyone. To me, tears were weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. But now, weakness consumed me, swallowing me whole, and there was no way to hide it. The whispers swelled again. I heard laughter this time, low and mocking, echoing from a corner of the courtroom. My eyes darted toward it, and my chest tightened. The humiliation I had once enjoyed inflicting on others was now being inflicted on me. People leaned into each other, shaking their heads, smirking, their eyes filled with judgment. My wealth, my beauty, my power, none of it mattered anymore. In that courtroom, I wasn't untouchable. I was broken. And then, the cruelest part, her silence. She sat there, my mother, watching me with those calm, steady eyes. She didn't speak, didn't gloat, didn't throw my cruelty back at me. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than all the whispers in the room. It reminded me of the street corner, of the day I mocked her publicly, when she had refused to fight back, when she had only given me that faint smile. I had mistaken it for weakness then. Now I realized it was strength, a strength I could never match. The tears finally fell. Hot, shameful streaks ran down my face, and I couldn't stop them. My chest heaved, my breath coming in broken gasps, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care who saw. The weight of guilt was too much. I was suffocating under it, drowning in it, crushed by the truth of what I had done. I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear, to escape the stares, the whispers, the unbearable humiliation. But there was nowhere to go. The courtroom was a prison, and I was trapped, chained not by walls or guards, but by my own sins. I covered my face with my hands, hoping to shield myself from the world, but the world didn't look away. The judge, the jury, my relatives, the strangers, they all watched as the woman who once carried herself like a queen now broke down like a child. The sound of my sobs filled the room, raw and unrestrained, and each one felt like another piece of my pride shattering into dust. I thought of her, my mother, the woman I had called pathetic, worthless beneath me. And yet, she was the one who held her dignity, who stood in strength while I crumbled. The contrast was unbearable. She had been stripped of everything, her home, her wealth, her child, yet she carried herself with grace. I had been given everything, handed a life of luxury on a silver platter, and I had destroyed myself with arrogance. The guilt suffocated me. My heart ached with a pain I had never known, a pain deeper than humiliation, deeper than shame. It was the pain of realizing I had become the very monster I once despised in others. I had mocked strangers for their suffering, belittled people for their hardships, and worst of all, I had mocked my own mother without even knowing her. The courtroom blurred with my tears. The voices around me were distant, but the feeling remained sharp, cutting into my soul with every heartbeat. I was collapsing, piece by piece, and no amount of pride could hold me together anymore. And then, amidst the storm of my breakdown, one question rose above the noise. It echoed in my mind, relentless, demanding, tearing at what little was left of me. Would I find the courage to speak to her? To face the woman who had given me life? To beg for forgiveness? Or would I remain silent forever, buried in the ruins of my pride? Would I find the courage to speak to her? Or stay silent forever? Her silence cut deeper than any words ever could. After my breakdown in court, I waited for her to strike. That was what I would have done in her place. If someone had mocked me, if someone had spat venom at me, if someone had humiliated me in public the way I had done to her, I would have seized this moment of weakness to return the cruelty tenfold. I would have gloated, shouted, pointed my finger, and declared victory in front of everyone. I would have crushed the enemy beneath my heel because that was how I had lived my life, believing that power meant breaking others when they were weakest. But she didn't do that. She sat there, her frail body upright in the witness chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't decipher. And then, slowly, I saw it. A tear slipped down her cheek. Just one, quiet and unannounced, glistening under the courtroom lights before it traced the deep lines of her weathered face. That single tear undid me more than all the whispers, more than all the laughter, more than the humiliation of the courtroom, because it wasn't a tear of victory. It wasn't a tear of satisfaction. It was a tear of grief, of sorrow, of love that had been denied too long. Her silence was not weakness. It was strength. It was dignity. And it cut through me like a blade. I couldn't look away. My body trembled, my face wet with shameful tears, but my eyes were locked on hers. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She wasn't celebrating my collapse. Instead, she looked at me with the kind of quiet sorrow that comes only from years of loss. Every tear she shed spoke of nights spent wondering where her child was, of the pain of seeing me from afar and knowing she couldn't reach me, of the unbearable weight of motherhood stolen. And yet, she didn't curse me. She didn't condemn me. Her silence was her answer, her dignity rising above the pettiness of revenge. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and gasps, grew still as people noticed her tears. There was something sacred about the moment, something so raw and human that it silenced even the cruelest tongues. The proud men and women who had judged her for years now looked at her differently. Not as a beggar, not as a stranger, but as a mother carrying a wound that never healed. I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. My wealth, my clothes, my status, all of it disintegrated under the weight of her silence. She didn't need to say anything. Her tears were louder than any words, her forgiveness more powerful than any judgment. I thought back to the street corner, to the day I had mocked her. I remembered the way she had smiled faintly at me, that same calmness I had mistaken for defeat. Now I understood what it was. It wasn't defeat. It was strength. It was the strength of a woman who had endured everything and still refused to let bitterness consume her. She had survived humiliation, betrayal, poverty, and the theft of her own child. And yet here she was, stronger than me, stronger than anyone in that room. The contrast was unbearable. I had lived in luxury, surrounded by excess, adored by people who feared me, and yet I had crumbled the moment the truth was revealed. She had lived in pain, in hunger, in silence, and yet she sat there with dignity that overshadowed all of us. My chest tightened with a pain so sharp I thought I couldn't breathe. I wanted to crawl across the floor, fall at her feet, and beg her to say something, to curse me, to hate me, to reject me. Anything would have been easier than her silence. But she gave me nothing except those quiet tears. And in those tears I saw everything. Years of sacrifice, years of loneliness, years of waiting for a child who never came back. The realization hit me with unbearable force. She had loved me all along. Despite my cruelty, despite my arrogance, despite the venom I had spit at her, she loved me still. Because mothers don't stop loving their children, even when their children destroy them. The dignity of her forgiveness overshadowed my downfall. I had been reduced to a sobbing mess, humiliated in front of everyone, but she sat with grace, her silence louder than all the noise around us. She wasn't there to destroy me. She was there because the truth demanded it. And now, that truth demanded something of me that I wasn't sure I could give. Would her heart ever allow me back? The thought tore at me. I wanted it desperately. I wanted her to reach out, to take me back, to tell me it wasn't too late. But how could I deserve that? How could I ask for forgiveness after everything I had done, after the years I had wasted believing I was better than her? The courtroom blurred again as tears filled my eyes. My pride was gone, my arrogance shattered. All that remained was a hollow shell of guilt, and a desperate, aching hope that maybe, just maybe, her heart had room for me still. But even as that hope flickered inside me, a darker fear rose. What if it was too late? What if her silence wasn't forgiveness, but a barrier that would never open? What if her tears were not an invitation but a farewell? My body trembled, torn between the desperate urge to run to her and the paralyzing fear of rejection. I didn't know which would be worse, her turning away from me, or her embracing me and forcing me to face the depth of what I had destroyed. The questions consumed me, burning hotter with each second that passed. Would her heart ever allow me back as her daughter? The proud woman who once mocked her now fell to her knees, begging. I had never begged for anything in my life. I had grown up with the belief that the world owed me everything, that I could demand, and it would be given, that I could command, and others would obey. Begging was for the weak, for the desperate, for people I had always considered beneath me. And yet, there I was, in the middle of a courtroom filled with strangers and family, lawyers and judges, enemies and spectators, on my knees before the very woman I had once humiliated. The words tore out of me before I even realized I was saying them. Mom? The sound of that word leaving my lips was like thunder crashing through my chest. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like an instinct, a truth that had been buried inside me for years, waiting for this very moment to surface. My voice cracked, raw with emotion, and the courtroom gasped. I heard the whispers ripple instantly. She called her mom. Did you hear that? She called her mom. After everything? But I didn't care about them anymore. For the first time in my life, their opinions, their judgment, their whispers meant nothing. All that mattered was the woman in front of me, the woman whose eyes had haunted me, whose silence had cut me deeper than any words, whose tears had revealed a strength I could never match. Mom, I said again, louder this time, my voice breaking as tears spilled down my cheeks. Please, please forgive me. The words poured out of me in sobs, desperate and uncontrollable. I clutched at the edge of her chair, trembling, my knees pressing into the cold floor. My tears fell onto the wood beneath me, each one a confession of guilt, each one a piece of my pride dissolving. I didn't know, I cried, my voice hoarse. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know the truth. But I was cruel, so cruel, and I can never take back the words I said. I called you pathetic, worthless. I mocked you as if you were nothing, and all along, you were my mother. My mother. My chest heaved, and my words broke apart into sobs. The room was silent except for me. Silent, yet heavy with emotion. I could feel the eyes of everyone in that courtroom, but I didn't care. For once I wasn't performing. For once I wasn't seeking admiration or fear. I was raw, broken, stripped of every mask I had ever worn. I pressed my forehead against her lap, clutching her frail hands in mine. They were rough and worn, nothing like the polished softness of my own, but they were warm, and that warmth broke me all over again. I don't deserve you, I whispered, choking on the words. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to even call you Mom, but I can't stop myself. I can't stop because it's the truth. You are my mother, and I am your daughter, and I have wronged you in the worst way. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The judge sat still, his gavel forgotten in his hand. The jury's eyes glistened with sympathy. Even my greedy relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to disguise the emotions flickering across their faces. Lawyers who had been hardened by years of battles now sat in stunned silence, some even bowing their heads as if in reverence for the rawness of the moment. But none of them mattered. Only she mattered. I lifted my head slowly, my eyes swollen with tears, searching her face for an answer. She looked at me the way she always had. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with that quiet, sorrowful strength that had unsettled me from the very beginning. Silent tears glistened on her cheeks, and I realized that in her silence was both pain and love. Mom, I whispered again, desperate. I can't undo the past. I can't give you back the years that were stolen from us. I can't erase the words I said to you, but please, please, let me try. Please let me make it right. Please don't turn away from me. I can live with the world hating me. I can live with losing everything I have, but I can't live knowing I've lost you forever. My voice cracked again, breaking under the weight of desperation. I clutched her hands tighter, my tears falling onto her skin. I'm begging you. Forgive me. Call me your daughter. Give me one chance to love you the way I should have. I don't deserve it, but I need it. I need you. The courtroom was no longer a place of law and justice. It had become a sanctuary of confession and truth. I could hear muffled sobs from the benches. People moved to tears by the sight of the once proud woman crumbling at her mother's feet. The same people who had whispered and mocked me hours ago now watched with sympathy, their judgment softening as they witnessed the truth of blood and love breaking through pride and shame. And yet, despite the flood of my words, despite my desperate plea, she remained silent. Her tears spoke for her trembling hands resting in mine, but her lips did not move. She didn't reject me, but she didn't embrace me either. She simply looked at me, her silence louder than all the cries in the room. And that silence tore me apart, because I didn't know what it meant. Did it mean forgiveness she couldn't put into words? Or did it mean her heart had endured too much to let me back in? The weight of years pressed between us, years of separation, years of betrayal, years of pain. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't something I could demand. It wasn't something I could buy or control. It wasn't even something I could beg for, no matter how desperately. Forgiveness was hers to give, and hers alone. I stayed there, kneeling, sobbing, waiting for a word, a touch, a sign that I hadn't lost her forever. But her silence stretched on, unbearable and unbroken, until the question rose inside me like a storm that refused to settle. Would she accept me or turn away forever? In the end, life gave me a choice: live with regret or seek redemption. For what felt like an eternity, the courtroom remained silent, the only sound my quiet sobs as I knelt at her feet. My hands clutched hers tightly, afraid that if I let go, she would vanish, disappear like a dream, leaving me alone with my shame. I had begged, I had cried, I had stripped myself of all pride, and yet she hadn't spoken. Her silence stretched across the room, heavy with meaning, heavy with years of pain neither of us could erase. I thought about all the choices I had made, the arrogance, the cruelty, the mockery, the pride that had blinded me for so long. Those choices had led me here, to this moment where everything I had once valued, wealth, reputation, admiration, meant nothing. All that mattered now was her answer. Would she accept me, or would she leave me in the ruins of my own arrogance? Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I felt her hand move. It trembled as it lifted, fragile and slow, and then gently rested on my head. The touch was so light, so tender, that it broke me all over again. I lifted my face, tears streaming, and saw her eyes. They were filled with sorrow, yes, but also with love. Love that had endured through betrayal, through years of silence, through humiliation and loss. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. In that touch, in that look, I found my answer. She hadn't turned away. She hadn't rejected me. She was still my mother. The courtroom stirred with emotion. I heard muffled sobs, saw people wiping tears from their eyes. Even the judge looked down, his expression softened. But none of them mattered to me anymore. For once, the world outside of us didn't matter. It was just her and me, mother and daughter, reunited not by circumstance but by truth. I knew then that redemption would not come instantly. Forgiveness was not a door you walked through once and left behind. It was a path, one that I would need to walk for the rest of my life. But I also knew that she had given me something more valuable than forgiveness. She had given me a chance to begin again. From that day forward, my life changed. I no longer walked through the world with arrogance. I no longer treated people as if they were beneath me. The wealth, the jewels, the luxury, they lost their shine. What good were chandeliers and pearls if I had once mocked the very hands that gave me life? My eyes opened to the truth I had ignored for so long. Pride is the heaviest burden a person can carry, and compassion is the only crown worth wearing. I began to spend time with her, not as a charity, not out of pity, but as her daughter. I listened to her stories of the life she had lost, of the sacrifices she had made, of the pain she had endured in silence. And with each story, I realized how much I had missed, how much time had been stolen from us. I could never give her back the years we lost, but I could give her the years ahead. And as I walked beside her in public, no longer ashamed of her poverty, I noticed something strange. People who once whispered about me now looked at me with something different. Not fear, not envy, but respect. Not the shallow respect that comes from wealth, but the kind that comes from humility. The transformation wasn't easy. Guilt still haunted me. There were nights I lay awake, replaying my cruelty in my mind, hearing the words I had once spat at her. There were moments I broke down again, overwhelmed by the shame of what I had done. But each time, she would sit beside me, her frail hand resting on mine, her silence comforting me more than words ever could. And in those moments, I understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it, learning from it, and choosing to live differently. The trial itself ended in ways I hadn't expected. The inheritance dispute, the accusations, the greed, it all seemed smaller in the shadow of the revelation. My relatives were silenced by the truth, their claims weakened by the evidence of their betrayal. Justice favored her, not me, and for the first time I didn't fight it. I didn't feel the need to win. Because winning had lost its meaning. All I wanted was her. Looking back now, I see my life divided into two halves. The life before I knew her, and the life after. The woman I was before, arrogant, cruel, untouchable, died in that courtroom. What was left was someone new, someone raw, someone who finally understood the weight of compassion. And to those listening, I say this: be careful of how you treat others. Pride is a fragile shield that shatters the moment truth strikes it. You never know who the stranger in front of you truly is. You never know what story they carry, what scars they hide, or what connection they may have to your own life. I mocked a woman once, believing she was beneath me. I laughed at her poverty, her frailty, her silence. But that woman turned out to be my mother, the very person whose blood runs through my veins. And that truth changed everything. So I leave you with this question, the same one that haunts me even now. What would you do if the person you mocked turned out to be your mother? Would you beg for forgiveness or walk away in shame? Would you beg for forgiveness or walk away in shame? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps us share more stories like this. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you discovered the person you mocked was your own mother? I read every response, and your thoughts matter here. And if you want more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe and join me on this journey of truth, lessons, and redemption.